phone on Monday.
Oh, that's right, because it conflicted. That's right. That's right. Sure.
Yeah.
It's easy enough to move it. And by the way, I'm getting the YouTube live stream going, so that.
Okay, great. Let me just close something in the background. Okay. So let's see. Stop the video for a little bit. So I guess we'll just wait a little bit to see if any other people show up, or
yeah, people will start dialing in.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. We'll just give it like 5 minutes and then start around 6:05. So
okay.
Barry is here. He's one of our old-time participants. Hey, Barry, how are you?
Hey, Barry. I'm also dropping the link to the YouTube live stream page. There is a chat. Hey, Barry. Just real quick, there is a chat to keep an eye on that's on the YouTube page too. And sometimes we'll see, like it happened this morning, we'll see people leave questions there too. So when we get to the Q&A part, we can look at the chat in Zoom and then the chat over on the YouTube page as well. So, and here, Shabs, let me set you as host now that I've got the live stream going. Okay, you should be a host now.
Yep, I got that. So I'll keep the YouTube running in the background so I can keep an eye on the chat.
Okay, yeah, please. That would be great.
Somebody's already left a comment there.
Okay. So
someone already left a comment, you said?
Yeah, somebody said hi.
Oh, okay, yeah. Hey, see, you were saying something?
Yeah, so did you start this, the Toronto group?
No. I joined it because earlier it was run by the Mars team. And at some point, Mars decided to kind of hand it off to the community. So that's when I became involved with so yeah, this group was started by a local accelerator called Mars Innovation.
Okay, I see. Okay. Okay, so now, I got both of my screens working, so I can put the YouTube one over here. Yeah. No. Okay, so that's over there now. And the Zoom chat is over here. Okay.
Shabs, we may want to get started. I see there's 4 people on the live stream, and people may dial in again as we get going.
Okay, that sounds perfect. Awesome. Hey guys, so welcome to the Toronto Hyperledger meetup. This is Shabs, your host from the community, and we have C. Chen joining us. He's the president of the Open Source Strategies. He's also the member of the SIG for climate change and accounting. So we are very excited to have him present his views on climate change, especially in the environment that we are in today. So C, please go ahead and do a more detailed introduction, and then you can kick off the session. Thanks.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me. So my name is Sai Chen, and I'm from Open Source Strategies in Los Angeles. So I wanted to, just share with you some of what we're doing on climate change with Hyperledger in the software and in the community as well. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself and my background. So how I found the climate SIG and got involved with Hyperledger, I used to be a hedge fund manager. So my background is actually on the business side. And from that, what I saw is that really climate change is a result of a market failure. In open source, we talk about something called the tragedy of the commons. And climate change is really the biggest tragedy of the commons out there, if you will. It's something that we all share together, and yet because nobody is in charge of maintaining it, things are happening that's making it worse. And about 20 years ago, I left fund management to start an e-commerce business with my wife. And being a very small startup company, we had no budget for expensive commercial e-commerce software. So we work with open source. And I can honestly say that open source software is what made our business work. It was low cost, but more importantly, it was very flexible to have something that we could modify and tailor to the needs of our business as it changed and grew over the years. So I started a company, Open Source Strategies, and originally we developed open source ERP and CRM software. We were part of the Apache Off-Biz project. I was a committer of this Apache project, and we developed something called the OpenTaps, open source ERP and CRM software, which has been used by a variety of companies. And I really got to see how you could use ERP and CRM, basically software, to run the world, if you will, like Mark Andreessen says. So a few years ago, I decided to try something in the field of open source energy efficiency, taking energy efficiency software and making open source software around it to help people manage their building energy more efficiently, and in that way, reduce their climate impact. What I found was that the incumbent institutions in that space, and by that I mean the utilities, the property owners, and the property managers, move very, very slowly. And as a result, it was a field that had a lot of potential, but is going kind of at a much slower pace than it should be, if you will. And finally, I started looking at ways to speed things up and found out about blockchain and Hyperledger. And I think it's amazingly enough a technology that could solve a lot of the climate related problems. And so that's how I got involved with the climate SIG and where I am today. So I'd like to tell you about what we've been doing. So first of all, what is the climate SIG? The climate SIG is actually called the Climate Accounting and Action Special Interest Group. So what is climate accounting and why is it important? Well, climate accounting is basically calculating emissions that are contributing to climate change from activities and measured emissions factors. So for example, if we know how many kilowatts hours of electricity you use in your building or in your home, there's published data that can be used to calculate how many metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents that was based on published utility data. And so that can be used to calculate the emissions of your home electricity use even the amount of power, let's say, that you're using right now to run your computer to listen to this call in terms of emissions impact. And similarly, if we knew how much you're driving in your car, we knew the miles per gallon of your car and how much emissions are coming out of each gallon of gasoline that's used, that could be used to calculate the emissions from you driving and taking a trip. And by the same token, for you to taking an airplane trip and so on and so forth. So the reason we have this kind of climate accounting is because we want to standardize all the different types of climate emissions, whether it's carbon dioxide, methane, different kinds of nitrogen emissions. And we also want to be able to standardize the measurement of positive and negative climate emissions, both things that are adding to greenhouse gas emissions and things that are removing it or reducing it. So since we're a technical crowd, I like to say that climate accounting is like TCP/IP for climate. It's basically the standard protocol that measures everything that's related to climate, and it's used to coordinate all the action that's out there. And why is this important? Well, climate accounting is the basis of climate action. And this is really important right now because we're coming to actually kind of a pivotal moment in the climate change situation where a lot of groups are now on board to do something about it. 70% of the people worldwide, and that includes most of the people in the United States, by the way, now believe that climate change is a real and serious problem. Only 3% think it's not serious at all. Those people just are able to get themselves on TV and make a lot of noise on Twitter, but they're definitely in the small minority. And this is in turn motivating major institutional investors, talking about BlackRock and some of the biggest pension funds in the world that manage trillions of dollars of assets, to come together and say, we need to do something about climate change. We need the companies that we invest in to do something. And that's in turn motivating major companies, both technology companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, obviously, but also companies like IKEA, companies like Kering, which is the second largest luxury goods company in the world that owns Gucci, to say, we need to do something about it. It's motivating these large utilities in the United States, Dominion Energy, Duke Energy, to pledge to become carbon neutral. Delta Airlines has pledged to become carbon neutral, and Lyft has been doing it. And most amazingly, Shell, the oil company, has pledged to become a carbon neutral company. So finally, what's good here is that technology is now available to scale renewable energy, electric vehicles, all these things that weren't there 10 years ago to make a positive impact on climate change are now available. So all these things are here, and we just need something to tie them all together so that we know what the impact of everybody is and how to coordinate it. And there's a lot of climate accounting being done today at every level. At the product level, there's something called life cycle analysis, which is basically a model of what happens to a product from the time when it's manufactured through its whole life of being used, and calculating its emissions impact on it. And these go into very elaborate documents called environmental product declarations, which detail many environmental attributes, including the emissions of a product. There are some industry-specific climate accounting standards like eGrid, which is for utilities in the United States, calculates their carbon emissions impact and is published by the EPA. There's building standards. The World Green Building Council LEED is another big one. And they're now turning towards zero carbon buildings and embedded carbon of buildings. There's things like Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the British Standards Institute, the past 2050, which is a long list of ways to measure the climate impact of an organization that covers the energy they use on site, purchase from utilities, all their transportation logistics, purchases of goods, leased assets, et cetera, et cetera. It's very extensive and thorough. There's organizations like Gold Standard and Verified Carbon Standard that measure the carbon impact of offset projects like forestry and land management type of projects. that are designed to take carbon emissions out of the atmosphere and sequester them to reduce the climate impact. At the consumer level, then there is organizations like Carbon Neutral, Climate Neutral, and a whole bunch of others now that certify products and companies as to their climate impact and if they are achieving carbon neutrality. And finally, for investors, there's something called the Carbon Disclosure Project, which has been around for a while, and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is a standard-making body for reporting carbon emissions, among other environmental and governance measures and social measures of major corporations. And finally, at the international level, you've probably heard of the Paris Agreement with national development goals and transfers, international transfers of mitigation outcomes, and a whole bunch of ways for countries to coordinate and account for their climate action. So at many different levels now, we've actually worked out protocols and ways to account for climate and emissions. The problem is that we have a lot of standards and they don't necessarily connect with each other. So for example, going back to this page, we're able to calculate the climate impact of individual products, but that's a very expensive and complicated analysis. And it doesn't necessarily go into the calculations of all the products that a company would buy. It's not been done for enough products, all the different types of products that are made out there. And then the company level standards don't necessarily get rolled up into the national level standards. A lot of major corporations reporting is survey-based and voluntary. So sometimes they're not very accurate and sometimes they're not very transparent. Company reports, this is our climate impact, but what is the data to back that up? And we don't really know. So if I told you that climate accounting is TCP/IP for climate action, now imagine a world where there's no TCP/IP, there's no common protocol for transferring of data on the internet. So let's imagine a world where video had a totally different protocol for addressing senders and recipients and transferring information than, say, emails and text messages, and everything was done differently. Well, you can imagine what that all means. So yeah, somebody says the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement today. So yeah, this is where people usually get into a question, ask me, well, the government should do this, right? This is a job, this is clearly what the government should do. So the reality of what the government does is this. Okay, here's a map of, or a chart of the emissions by sector in the United States. So transportation, 29%, electric power, 28%, industrial, 22%. This is, a lot of it is from big industrial things like cement and steel. So transportation emissions are regulated by, in the United States, the EPA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, and the California Air Resources Board, specifically for the state of California, but in some ways a leading indicator for the rest of the country. Except airline transportation is regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration. And then intermodal transportation is regulated by 10 different agencies of the United States Department of Transportation. And that's not counting for all the different local MTAs and bus systems that also regulate their own emissions and transportations, taxi authorities, and so on. Electric power is regulated by the Federal Electricity Regulatory Council, 9 independent system operators that are basically agglomerations of regional utilities. Every state has a public utility commission that regulates what its utilities does. And then every city has its own building codes that govern the energy efficiency, energy use policy. And in the case of New York City, carbon emissions of the buildings in New York City. So on this side, we've got all sorts of different agencies regulating all sorts of interesting things that have to do with carbon emissions. And then in the industrial sector, Okay, nobody regulates the carbon emissions of cement making, as far as I know. Cement, if it were its own country, I read, would be the third largest emitter of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions in the world after the United States and China. But here, at least, there's no entity that regulates it. Another high emitting sector is steel. The EPA did a study of emissions of the steel industry in 2009. And that's basically where we are in terms of any kind of regulation of steel industry emissions. So, and I could go on about all these other sectors, but just see that in our country alone, we have either hundreds of different agencies that are involved with emissions or nobody doing it at all. And there's 195 countries in the world. So it's a tall order for the government to say, okay, there will be one entity that can regulate all of it. And this is why I feel like the blockchain is the perfect technology here. It's something that we need for emissions, because the blockchain allows you to share data across a lot of different activities, which is exactly what emissions is. It's caused by different types of activities all over the place. And the trust in an immutable ledger means that the data is placed on this ledger, and once it's there, it's always going to be there. So you don't have to worry about API endpoints changing, APIs getting taken away and disappearing anymore. And this is very helpful for anybody who's ever done enterprise software and done integration and torn their hair out because you finally got an integration working and whoa, they discontinued that API. And by having this common ledger, we can then integrate emissions across a lot of different industries and standards. And this gives us efficient data collection, emissions calculation, and most importantly, it allows us to have trust and collaboration without a central authority. It allows us, in other words, to do something about climate change and about carbon emissions without waiting for somebody to magically come along and put all this stuff together. And that's what we're doing at the Hyperledger Climate SIG. So we're a global group of developers who are working on climate and blockchain. And we're working on shared protocols and standards to allow interoperability, how to integrate different blockchains together through those protocols, and eventually enable contractual automation between climate and finance and all sorts of different things that have to do with climate, and put together the best practices. And most importantly, write code. We're building software right now that we're looking to deploy to help do climate accounting and climate action. So some of the groups were divided into different working groups. There's a standards group. I'm mostly involved with the climate accounting group, which is accounting and certification of emissions. There's a consumer disclosure group that's working on how to make people aware of their emissions impact. And then we've been working on starting an energy industry specific group, because there's a lot of things that have to do specifically with the energy industry, and it overlaps with some of the other efforts of the energy field. So, and we also have participation from all over the world. So if you want to take a look at our members directory, you see we've got people from Canada, Singapore, Malaysia, obviously here in the United States, South Africa, India, Japan. I mean, it's an open source community, people come and go, but this is something that people all over the world care about and want to get involved in. And we're also involved with other groups like the Yale Open Lab. Martin, who started the group, is involved with that. The Interwork Alliance is a consortium of some of the largest companies in the world working together on climate-related issues. We're involved with the Climate Change Coalition, started by one of the people who started the community, the Climate SIG, and the Climate Ledger Initiative. And so periodically you get a lot of interesting and different presentations on a variety of topics, like how to use the blockchain to gather data for carbon offset accounting, what we could be doing in the energy industry, in solar finance. So because climate is such a broad field, there's a lot of different areas that we're also working on and related to. So just want to take a little break and see if anybody has any questions about what we've talked about so far. Because now I'm going to dive into some actual potential use cases.
Hey folks, so please feel free to use the chat to post your questions. I don't see any questions coming in on YouTube, but if you guys have any questions, just put it on the Zoom channel. I'll keep a watch out on YouTube as well.
Okay, great. So in terms of software that we've been working on, let's think about a use case where, let's imagine there's no central authority or registry, but there's accepted common standards on how to calculate emissions. Okay, and it's a pretty simple format. Like I said earlier, you know how many kilowatt hours of electricity, you can figure out the emissions. And so instead of one central government authority or registry, there's a network of independent auditors. All of us are following common accepted standards, and we want to be able to publish results, emissions results that are trusted by the market, by the general public, by investors. This is where we see as a use case for the blockchain and doing climate accounting, a network of nodes for different auditors linking together in a ledger, all of us using open source chain code to implement those standards. So this is a chart Martin did. And the way to think about it is, let's start at the bottom. And what you have are all sorts of business activities, okay? Like, electricity being used, a trip being taken in a car, some products being purchased. All these things are then, through trusted credentials, being stored on a distributed ledger. And following a set of common standards, they are then accessible by client applications to then feed a variety of different applications at the top, which could do things like automatically verifying the total emissions of a company and publishing that. Another application could say, okay, we're going to offset your emissions by automatically transacting in carbon offsets and in emissions reduction. So a whole bunch of applications could plug into a distributed ledger where the data comes from actual business activities. So a simple example is a utility bill, okay? So you get a utility bill every month or so, right? And it tells you how much energy you use, number of kilowatt hours. So here in the United States, there's something called the Green Button Standard, and it's an XML format that allows us to get utility bill data. So we get that into something called OpenTabs, which is an open source energy management software that we developed. It then talks through a REST API to a Fabric SDK, which is in Node.js, which then runs chain code. So right now it's going to the Amazon DynamoDB, a cloud-based database, to look up emissions factors to be able to calculate from your kilowatt hours of energy use the amount of actual emissions. And we're also looking at using IPFS to store those utility bills. So it's archived in case anybody wants it. And then those emissions are then stored on a Hyperledger Fabric data channel. And this is what it looks like. You're not missing much. It's okay, let me just stop sharing it 1 sec. One sec, let me get the Okay, so let us play this again. So this, I'm going to show you how we're actually starting up Hyperledger and recording data. Yeah. It's packaging and deploying the chain code right now. This part takes a little longer, but I want you to see it. This is a real recording.
Thanks. Maybe I can ask you a quick question while this is deploying.
Yes, please.
So in terms of having the network, because this will be running in your own network, how would you make this accessible globally, so it can be a part of a global network?
Yeah, that's what we're working on. And the idea is to create a network of several different organizations. So it is a permission ledger, but we want to open it up so that there could be peer nodes running all over the world in the cloud together. So
got it. Okay. And
we're working on the deployment right now.
And is it like based on permission access, meaning the committee decides who are the joining members?
Yes, I think it's going to be like that. And I think what we want to do is pretty loosely allow people in that, are just going to be people with not a super tight membership requirement, but just at this stage, just whoever's interested in using it and joining in the deployment.
Got it. Okay. And how many founding members are kind of launching this?
I think 2 or 3 of us. Okay. So that are active in the development right now.
Okay. Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks, Sai.
Sure. So yeah, that's basically what it looks like in terms of what it looks like right now in terms of a demo of where we are. You see a ledger being created. So some of the code, okay, this is the Node.js SDK that's used to go in between basically our Django Python application and communicate with the chain code. This is the SDK that then invokes the chain code. And this is the chain code itself that runs the basically emissions calculations and then records data on the chain. So, and this is all open source, by the way, so you can go look at it yourself and set it up and run it. So, okay. So a lot of the interesting questions actually on the YouTube channel is leading me up to this slide. Where do we go with this? Will innovations with silver be useful for regenerative technology? I don't know. I am not an expert on regenerative technology. Percent of the different offshore wind and onshore wind that work and solar panels. Again, not an expert on renewable energy myself. My specialty is, I hope, data and analysis of data and connecting them together as markets. The F-35 is combat ready 11% of the time. Definitely not an expert on the F-35. Sorry, can't help you at all with that one.
I think that looks to be a spammer. I think we can move on.
Okay, yeah. No, I'm just, but I think but the point of this actually is that this is an architecture. You just saw one channel of data, which is utility emissions. But the ability to then scale this up with a lot of different channels of data, okay? So you can have utilities, you can have driving records from a mobile app, you can have flight records from corporate travel, you can have logistics and transportation from UPS, FedEx, from Flexport, I guess different logistics applications. All of those could provide you with data, which can then be calculated as emissions. And then on the other side, you can have your renewable energy certificates, carbon offsets, and even satellite generated data about emissions and offsets. And together, they could all be joined as assets or tokens on a common emissions channel. This is what I call net emissions. And I'm working out ways to join them all together so that you could calculate the net emissions by combining data from all these channels. And then you could pass it on to your customers as their emissions. And then that could be used to join all of their different activities. So all these things could be used to calculate emissions by scaling up in something that we call the multi-channel architecture. And the other thing that's related to this, and what's kind of cool, is decision-making about climate change. You could have something called a climate DAO, distributed autonomous organization, so that people who are involved in the climate projects, climate action for a company, could open it up to the customers of the company and to members of the public, as well as experts, to collectively make decisions on something that they care about without a lot of layers of intermediaries or complexity, while preserving the benefits of expertise and experts who are watching over this. So these are kind of two things that I feel the blockchain could be very powerful for. One is basically getting the data and calculating it correctly and passing emissions through the whole supply chain. And two is really bringing people together to take collective action without all the problems that we have of collective decision-making. So some of the use cases, okay. It's a virtual community solar project. This is actually something we're talking about very seriously now in the group. So once you have your utility bills and you know how much emissions you're generating, you could actually offset that by buying renewable energy certificates so that you could have the benefits of solar without having to put solar panels on your own roof, which you may not be able to because you rent, or because you're living somewhere temporarily, or maybe where you are is not too suitable the way the house is built for solar. And we could create a group that can then invest in a solar project together, and then the members get the benefits of their renewable energy, both financially and in terms of their climate offsets. And they could carry those around. So you could move around from apartment to house to a different place, and you're still generating a certain amount of renewable energy that you could use to offset your carbon footprint. Another interesting one is virtual zero carbon transportation. So we're all very excited about electric vehicles, and some of them are very cool, but also a lot of emissions go into making a new car. I mean, and that's the case whether it's an electric vehicle or a gasoline powered or diesel powered car. So another way to reduce our carbon emissions from transportation is to get accurate travel data and offset those with carbon offsets, which could be projects that reduce emissions in a lot of different ways. And so then scaling that up a bit, you could then start collecting all of your emissions data in personal offset wallets. So you could have a wallet that collects all your emissions from all these different channels and automatically purchase your offsets. And finally, a data center carbon emissions. We're all working with data centers and we're familiar with what they do. Primary source of their emissions is from utilities, and basically you could get their utility bills and then allocate that to the amount of compute and storage resources they're providing, and then from that calculate what each user, their computation activities and so on is generating. So in terms of the roadmap ahead, what we're working on now is the utility emissions and the renewable energy certificates and offsets. And from that, we're going to have what we call our minimum viable product, MVP. It's going to allow you to basically offset your utility related emissions. And we're going to create a small open source climate action network. We're going to implement an open source distributed autonomous organization for then deciding on the offsets and the renewable energy certificates. And then to have really this open source community of users and developers working together to create a sustainable sort of development for this project. We'll basically be offsetting our own emissions, enhancing our own code, and hopefully bringing more people on board. And in that process, developing additional use cases. So as we wrap up, why open source? Well, it's all open source in that the blockchain is open source, Hyperledger is open source, our code is all open source to start with. But a couple more important points. Open source is what gives us transparency and trust. Because otherwise, a company or a government agency tells you these are the emissions from something. Well, how do you know that that's true? And will people trust it to take action? Well, open source guarantees that it is, because we give you the code, you know how it's been calculated, and you can even get the data or hashes of the data to verify it's correct. The other really important thing about why it needs to be open source is that, and this is something from my own personal experience, seeing how important the flexibility of open source has been to our own business here, is that climate change is a global problem that requires local solutions. In the United States, emissions come from buildings and cars, transportation and electricity. So the solution is basically renewable energy of some form to change what we power ourselves with. But there's agricultural countries out there, and their solution could require changes in land use and agricultural practices. So there's a lot of different technologies that could help reduce emissions. But what we want is to have an open source platform to help coordinate and account for all of that. And finally, I think that the open source approach, being bottoms up and innovative, is very powerful. You know, from the internet itself to all these different programming languages that we use, to the REST API, to the blockchain, Bitcoin and Ethereum. These all came out of basically this open source world where ideas come from anywhere and can spread on their own merits. And that's been extremely powerful, as we see in software. And I think it's going to be very important for solving the climate problem. But it doesn't have to be just a free community as well. Because now open source business models, there's really new opportunities now that we have the blockchain. So when we first started open source strategies, doing open source ERP and CRM, there really was basically, you could provide commercial services, and maybe sometimes you could sell some commercial licenses to business customers for your open source software. Basically, you were providing support. And then the SaaS model came along. So you could give out open source software and then have a hosted version of your software. And those have been successful, but the blockchain takes us a step beyond all of that, in that you can now have a transactional network that runs open source software. In our case, climate accounting and climate offsetting. And so then there could be tokens that represent basically fee to use the network. And as developers, we get tokens for working on and contributing to the network. And as more and more people use the network, the value of those tokens increase, or the number of transactions increases. So those tokens become more valuable, basically, as the network grows. So this gives us a whole new way to say, let's all get together and develop open source software together. And I don't know what made me think of this one, but in case you're part of the 3% that doesn't believe in climate change, just realize that climate is the biggest opportunity for blockchain on a global scale. I mean, it's really a chance for you to work on climate technology, on blockchain technology that addresses a global problem that 70+% of the people, plus all the major corporations and the biggest investors in the world, are signed on to work on together. And this is something where there's not really an incumbent software that you're competing against, but a wide open green field of opportunity. And so it's easier to think big in that case. So here are some links to the Climate SIG. There's an event, actually, pretty interesting event called the Open Climate Collaborathon that's starting next week. And it's going to be an event for all sorts of people all over the world to work together on open source and climate together. And finally, if you want to see more of the software that I just talked about, it's at opentaps.org. So that's basically my presentation. Happy to take any questions and you may have.
Thank you, Sai. That was a fantastic walkthrough of all the work you've done. So it was really insightful. Thank you for that.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah. We have one question here. It's basically asking, what about the carbon credits? Are they accounted for in this network?
The carbon credits, if you mean by carbon offsets, that's the idea of the net emissions calculation. So the idea is you have emissions calculated and then maybe turned into some kind of a token and asset. And then over here, you have the credits, meaning offsets from, say, forestry or regenerative agriculture or whatnot on this side. And together they would be accounted for and offset with each other.
Got it. Okay. I think in some cases, it's probably the government which also needs to get involved to issue the credits, right? So would you also have government participation in the network?
That would be great, but they don't have to be issued by the government. So for example, there are standards like the gold standard and verified carbon standards that verify carbon credits. And actually in that field, there's two kinds. There's, I guess, the government level credits for measuring carbon emissions and mitigation outcomes. And then there's what's called voluntary credits that are primarily projects that are invested in by individuals and businesses to offset their emissions. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, that does. Yes, thanks, Sai. Hey, yeah, Tim, thank you for posting the link for the collaborathon. So if anyone is interested for next week.
Yeah.
And there's also the link to join the Carbon SIG group on the Hyperledger as well, right?
Yes. So that's the first link, and we have a mailing list. We actually have calls almost every week now. So every other week we have either a sort of general call or a programming call. It's kind of a developer's call where we really get into just coding and development issues.
Oh, awesome. When does the meeting run?
Actually, the next developers meeting is tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time, because we had to move it from to make way for the collaborathon next week. So, and that's on our mailing list.
Awesome. Okay, that sounds great. Awesome, good stuff. All right, thank you so much, Sai. We have a few minutes left. If anyone wants to ask any questions, please go ahead. And either on YouTube or on the Zoom. Or if anyone wants to maybe just, I mean, if there are no more questions, we can probably even do a little bit of networking and just discover who is attending today, so. Yeah, I love to kind of meet people, and sometimes, coming to these meetings, online, we don't really get to chat. So, yeah. So I'm going to do a quick introduction, and if anyone wants to join in, hopefully, we can kind of see who's participating today. So, yeah, my name is Shabs. I'm part of the Toronto Hyperledger organizer team. By day, I'm the founder of a company called Trusted Space, and we help to connect people online in a digital hub. So you can find out more on trusted.space. And I'm interested in blockchain technology. I've been part of the meetup group, and I've attended a lot of events and also hosted a few of them. And we also have the other organizers with us. So, hey, Tim or Alice, you guys want to do a quick intro?
Oh, hey guys. Yeah, thanks for hosting this. And it's a really nice talk. I really like the concept that C has provided. Yeah, I'm Alice, so I'm one of the organizers as well. I'm a software developer. And last time that we did something related to Hyperledger Aries. I think next time we're gonna go with Fabric. So yeah, keep in touch with our meetup page, and feel free to suggest any events in the future.
And I'm Tim. I invited Sai to speak with us today. And I'm a co-organizer of the Collaborathon. So if anyone has any questions in the last 5 minutes about the Collaborathon, I can address those as well.
Awesome, thank you. Anyone else wants to just quickly do a quick introduction? David, I don't know if you're still on, but if not, I mean, Barry, we'd love to kind of have the collaboration going within the community.
Yeah, I'm still on. This is David. I'm here as a staff member from Hyperledger, and I'm here to support anything the community is trying to do. That includes both the climate SIG that we've been talking about, as well as all these virtual meetups. So it's great to hear what people are interested in and just how I can help.
Yeah, and I'm Barry Pratt. I've been involved in actually blockchain technology since about 2016 or so. I was lucky enough to be on one of the teams that actually won the first summer Ethereum hackathon that was put on by Blockchain Canada, and from that went on to work with some area people and put together a blockchain course that helped to bring together executives and entrepreneurs and actually teach them just what was blockchain, how it could help their business, and new business models and in digital transformation that really couldn't be done any other way. And so when I saw this talk this evening on climate change and using Hyperledger as a way to bring together multiple companies, multiple different industries across countries, and to be able to count up usage and then carbon credits and do some serious and real verifiable trading. It looked like a stellar use case for blockchain technology, and I'm really hoping that there's some great success in this project.
Thanks, Barry. Either Jack or Marcelo, you guys want to do an intro?
So Marcelo, I am in Toronto doing system integration. I have been following up Hyperledger for only 1 year, so I am relatively new to the topic. Just passionate about climate change, and I was very interested in learning more.
Awesome, thank you. Jacket? You might be on mute, Jacket, if you want to just introduce yourself. Okay, I think he's probably not accessible, but thank you, Sai. That was a fantastic session. Thank you, Tim, for doing the introductions. And I think, we are done with the time slot that we have, but hopefully we'll be able to connect on the Collaborathon and also connect with you on the SIG.
Yeah, Tim, you asked this interesting question about time of the day, where we are in the process of adoption, right?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you had a feeling, for that person.
Yeah, and my general feeling is very early right now, because this field really is kind of a green field that doesn't have common standards yet, doesn't have even an incumbent player. So in that sense, it's good for an open source product, just like it was in the early days of the internet for all these open source projects to come to the fore. I think that, and we can talk more about this during the Collaborathon, but I think what's missing in terms of adoption is really something that ties climate to something that people care about and are aware of. Because climate is this huge thing, but it's kind of abstract for most people to be thinking about carbon emissions, parts per million, and all these measures. But now it's having an impact on real things, that people care about. Like my favorite one is the beer versus Bordeaux problem, right? It's affecting the wine regions of the world, and it's also affecting beer brewing and availability of hops for beer. So those are things that people care about. And if we can somehow tie the things that people care about, whether it's art or skiing or beer or wine or whatever, and make them see that their actions are on climate have an impact on something that's very real to them, then I think we can take this whole thing a big step forward. So that's my,
Brilliant.
yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think we don't have any other questions, guys. So again, I'm going to thank everyone for attending, and we will be able to replay the recording on YouTube and circulate it if you want to review it. But have a fantastic rest of the evening, and Sai, thank you again.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Take care, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
See you guys.